Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Martijn Stroom will define the academic thesis location-wise behavioral location decisions. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear members of the committee, family, friends, colleagues, welcome. And I'm very happy to stand here in front of you, but I'm even more happy to stand here in front of you in person. And for most of us, it wasn't evident that this.
Please readjust the microphone to your mouth.
And for most of us, is this better? God is with me at least, that's good. So, for most of us, it wasn't evident that we were here in person. And recently, we might have already forgotten the extent of it, but for a long time, the pandemic has had a severe impact on our lives. For a long time, past the health risks, of course, we were not able to do what we wanted to do. We were not able to go where we wanted to go, meet who we wanted to meet, work where we wanted to work, or go where we wanted to go. Again, always important. That's one. It's actually important, so we mention it twice. Now, these are not trivial, and these are not trivial decisions, and we see this from the behavior that happened during the pandemic. So after the start of the pandemic, we significantly started changing our behavior. So we started to go to work less, we started to commute less, but we also we were at home more, we went to parks significantly more. So these decisions were important, but they were also new. And in order for us to understand how we can align our behavior with our preferences, how to create pandemic policies that achieve what they aim to achieve, or how we understand how we make these decisions, we need to look further in a couple of these examples. And I will discuss three specifically. I will discuss whether or not we decide to go outside, whether or not we will work from home, and whether or not we were meeting other peoples. Now, we start technically in the first decision that the pandemic laid upon us. Will we even go outside? This for a long time was a very risky decision, and we were always told to stay at home as much as we can, and the Netherlands was relatively liberal in this, so we were not staying, and we were not at house arrest, so we were allowed to leave the house, but we were told to avoid busy places, avoid crowded areas, intelligent lockdown. And often it worked very well, but at times it also escalated. Specifically in the summer, we all remember, we got international fame for how well we didn't avoid the crowded areas. Beaches were filled. And how could this be? So how did we not care? Did we make bad decisions? Was the information available to people to make these decisions maybe not accurate? And in order to investigate this, in chapter 2, I give people an experiment. So I tell people, imagine now you look outside your window. At first, it could be very quiet on the street. In another condition, I ask people, it's slowly getting busier. And in the third condition, I tell people it's as busy as it was last year. For the watchful eyes, you even see my supervisor walking his kid again in the normal conditions. So it's really a condition that we identify ourselves with before the pandemic. And then I ask him the following question. Will you go outside to a familiar recreational spot? And the results are interesting. So first, The first results of the first conclusion that we draw is that a lot of people are not going, which is very good. If they were going, maybe we wouldn't be here today. So that's already good. But we also see that there seems to be some weird pattern going on in the contexts. It's not linear, so it's not the more people are outside, the more likely I am willing to go. But what we see is that, for instance, specifically in the situation in which it's very empty outside, or it's very quiet outside, most people go. And to understand why most people go, we look a bit deeper on who is going in these conditions. And when we look at this, we see that specifically highly educated people are more willing to go in the quiet condition. And we also see that generally older people are less likely to go, and this could be related, of course, to the increased health risks that they experience. But specifically, the highly educated people are likely to go, and we conclude from this, or we suggest from this, that it could be that people are thinking that they're outsmarting other people. If we see it's empty of the streets, then potentially nobody's going, therefore I could go, and then it will still not be busy on the street. Now, overall, we conclude from this chapter that if policymakers want to provide people with should provide people with relevant information in order to make them use the policy in the correct term. If we don't do it, people might use information that's alternative, related, but maybe not accurate, and it could lead to suboptimal decisions. The second problem that we will discuss today is whether or not people will work from home. Now, working from home is not new due to the pandemic. We've been experimenting with it before, but we see that during the pandemic, this of course skyrocketed. And a lot is being said, whether or not the people are productive, whether or not people like it, whether or not people want to continue. And it's not only internationally, but also national coverage by Linde Kattenberg. You might think, is this the Linde Kattenberg? This is indeed the Linde Kattenberg that's also discussing it, so it must be very important. Now, the success normally of working from home is determined by whether or not people are productive, yes or no, but what has gathered limited attention is whether or not people, the physical climate that people do it in is affecting their productivity. And it's not evident that it's not, because when we were working from home, we all know that we were doing it at the most random places. And it could be that if you're doing it in a worse spot or in a worse office, it could hamper your productivity and also your willingness to continue working from home. So in chapter 4, we assess whether or not the satisfaction with your office has a relationship to your productivity. We look at the input. We look at 3 specifics. We look at the hardware to begin with, so whether or not you like your desk, your chair, your screen, so forth. We look at the indoor environment, whether or not you like the air quality, the noise, or the temperature. And we look at the amount of ventilation. And this is a room characteristic. So we look at whether or not you're opening a window physically. And as an outcome variable, so as a result, we look at productivity. Productivity, we use a questionnaire that we validate in chapter 3. We look at burnout propensity, so how likely are you on the burnout scale, or how high are you on the burnout scale, and whether or not you're willing to continue working from home. Now, the first outcomes might not be surprising, but are still very informative. We see that if satisfaction goes up with either the hardware or the indoor environment, productivity goes up, the willingness to continue working from home seems to go up, and the burnout propensity seems to go down. This is good news. So now we know we should care about it. But we also see that opening the window, so physically opening the window, improves your satisfaction and by extent seems to improve productivity. Now, this is also good news, so we seem to be able to influence this. But what we also see, it also influences the hardware satisfaction, and this is a little bit odd. So why would I open the window and feel better about my chair? And we hypothesize that people that open the window are generally more satisfied, and the general satisfaction carries over in both of the domains. Now, I hear you say, or I hear you think, I don't hear you say, I hear you think, that's all nice, we open the window, but it's going to be summer, it's going to be hot, we don't have air conditioning, that must influence my performance. So we got you covered there too. We did an experiment, and we put people in a lab. We put students in a lab. We had half of the people we put at a normal temperature, 22 degrees, and half of the people we put at 28 degrees. We set them there for 2 hours. They really enjoyed this. And at the end, we let them do some performance tasks. A heuristics performance task, which is slightly nice puzzles, and a risk task. And what we see here is that we see strong gender differences. Now, this is not surprising. In the literature, we already know that there are big gender differences in preferences for temperature, and we see that also in our experiment. So, for instance, we see that men seem to complain in hot temperatures. If we ask people, if we ask men, well, we ask them both, but men will say that a hot temperature will really decrease their performance. If they would be in a nicer area, if they would be in normal temperature, they would really be performing way better. Women don't seem to be bothered too much. And that's in line with the literature. Women seem to tend to have a preference for a higher temperature. But if we look at what they actually do, we see no difference. So if we would just go on the preference, then we would say for men, we really need to decrease the temperature. But if we look at the performance, it doesn't really seem to affect their performance. Interesting side note on this is that we also look at risk, and here we see that women tend to be more risk-seeking in hot temperatures. Now, the conclusion, one of my colleagues, Ben, I'm trying to see if I can find him, but there he is. Well, the conclusion that Ben drew from this is that if women are more risk-seeking in hot temperatures, if you want to ask out a girl, you should do this in the sauna. Now, whether or not I fully support this conclusion, maybe you want to do this on the bathrobe day, but this is besides the point. All right, so if we see that in the satisfaction, there seems to be a little bit of a discrepancy with whether or not we're accurately measuring what we're actually doing, and we also see this in heat, then is there also some limitations of self-report and productivity? Now, in chapter 3, I tried to also explore this a bit. And we seem to have suggestion to the following conclusion. Now, imagine I'm asking two people at the same time, or not at the same time, I'm asking two people at two different times. Once in summer, and once in winter. In winter, they say I'm a 6 out of 10 productive, and in winter, they say I'm an 8 out of 10. And then in winter, I asked them again, okay, now you're an 8 out of 10, but do you remember what you were during summer? Now, ideally, they will be very close to the 6, but what we seem to find is that they're relatively close to what they are currently, so their winter productivity. Now, this is what we call carryover effect or recall bias, so we're trying to remember it's probably affected more by your current state than by the state in the past, which is maybe a limitation for using productivity questionnaires over time. Now, completely concluding the working from home material that we discussed is that the future of working from home could severely benefit from looking at optimizing the physical climate, but focusing solely on self-report might be misleading. And now we come to the last category. Will I meet other people? Now, this has been an intrinsic need to connect to social people. I don't know about you, but for me, this was a really strong need. And generally, it seems to be a very strong need. And during the end of the pandemic, we seem to find ourselves in these decisional situations often. I want to meet this person, but he met somebody that was infected very recently, or I want to meet this person, but he meets a lot of people, and there were also a lot of people infected. How do I weigh these risks? How do we guesstimate or estimate these risks? So in order to investigate this, we had an experiment in chapter 6. We did an experiment in which we showed people 14 networks, the networks that you see at the bottom. And in these networks, it was you, there were some people, some friends, and also in the network, you knew there were some infections. And for each of these infections, you knew that it would be passed on with a 50% likelihood. So this was all stable. And then we asked people to rank these networks on riskiness. Which do you feel more risky, which are less risky? And what we conclude is that people are not completely, fully accurate. Not completely surprising, but people are not fully accurate. What, for instance, people perceive, our sample perceives as the number one most risky network is actually not even in the top 3, but the number 5 out of 14. Now, how could it be? And we try to estimate which characteristics are best in predicting what is the most risky network. In other words, can we find characteristics of visual characteristics of a network that we use to estimate that risk? And we see that people tend to use the easier to judge characteristics to guesstimate the complex risk. Specifically, we find that the ratio or the percentage of infections to non-infected people in the network, we weigh very heavily on risk. Even if we keep the risk of 2 networks stable, the one that has higher ratio of infected, we will perceive as more risky. Objective probability of infection is still there, so the objective risk is still very valid, so we're not completely randomly choosing networks, but we see that we tend to also lean towards different characteristics. So we conclude from this, last takeaway, in order to make sense of complex networks, people use network characteristics to guesstimate the risk of the network. Now, one second. So what do we conclude now from this? You might argue, okay, this is nice, but then pandemic is gone. What are the implications of this, of all this corona research? We must have seen a lot, so why do we still care about this? Now, generally, we see that the will I go outside results show clear implication for policies. We see that if we have to, if we make policies, if we develop policies, we must also understand how people perceive those policies and what people do with these policies. If we want to have people avoiding busy places, we need to give them information, but this is for all policies. If we look at working from home, this is still valid. Even after the pandemic, working from home will be in our lives for estimated 60% of the people want to work from home in the future. So to optimize this, it's still very important to look at what makes people productive, what makes people satisfied, and what makes people want to continue working from home or doesn't want to make people work from home. Will I meet other people is a little bit more abstract, if you may. You might argue, okay, these networks and the risk is something that I will probably not, or let's say, hopefully not encounter in the future. But it's also about understanding the networks. It's how do we perceive networks? And we see networks all around us. It's not only in the pandemic context. We also see that innovation spread is in networks, relationships, social things, businesses, success of business might be related to network. So it's important to understand whether or not we're able to estimate that the network's complexity, but also what we should take into consideration or what we might actively need to ignore in the understanding of these networks. So taken together, this dissertation tends to contribute to a deeper understanding of how people make decisions. Where we decide to go matters to us. We exert effort in figuring it out, where to work, where to go, and who to meet. And if we understand how people can make wise decisions, we hope to understand how people make wise decisions concerning their locations, or when people are location-wise. With this, I would like to give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by the chair of the assessment committee, Professor Rachel Poelnel, and she's a professor in arts and finance.
Thank you, esteemed chair. Esteemed candidate, dear Martijn, firstly, congratulations on a really well-written dissertation. I think you've done an amazing job in communicating some really highly relevant aspects of things that we all face during COVID, having to, live through COVID and the pandemic, working from home, and of course the quality of working from home really relies very much on those factors that you've actually communicated well today, such as the healthy indoor climate, the setting, the space, etc., but also highly on communication and collaboration with team members when you're working. And coming to communication, I think that's one of your fantastic strengths, and I think it's also worthy of mentioning all the blogs and the extra areas in which you have communicated many of these findings during COVID. So I think perhaps for you, COVID was fairly bittersweet because it gave you a great treatment or a great opportunity to be able to look at these interventions in your research as well. So I'm going to focus on a more general question, and the question that really arises from your dissertation, and I think it's at the forefront of many discussions that organizations are currently having about coming to terms with how we work from home post-COVID. And the fundamental question really that a lot of organizations are grappling with is how to maintain this productivity in the workspace, or even to try and improve productivity, when in a world where countries are, like the Netherlands, are actually slipping down in the ranks of terms of losing productivity, whilst maintaining their competitiveness as an organization, because they don't want to lose the best workers to those companies who, of course, can offer working from home. And this is something the university is also encouraging, that we work 40% at home as well. And I brought this supplement, which came yesterday in the FT, the Modern Workplace People, Why Employment It Is at Home. I'll give it to you afterwards in case you haven't seen it. Paul asked me if I wanted to bring the newspaper in because I might be bored of the presentation, but it was because of the supplement here. And it's so important to be able to understand if we go into lockdown again with new pathogens and another pandemic potentially, how we're going to also get through maintaining working from home better. So a nice general question to put you at ease. I know you had a nervous week. What policies or guidelines would you therefore advocate for individuals, like myself, organizations like the UM or society like the Netherlands, to take into consideration when you're working from home? Is it really as simple as ventilating a space at home, installing a thermostat, getting myself a good desk and chair, making sure my husband and my children aren't at home? Maybe I need to get rid of the dog because I see in table 4.4 that increases the associated burnout propensity. And actually, I thought I had a good space at home, but when I see in table 4.1 that the average space is 25 square meters, now I'm feeling also a little bit that perhaps that was related to productivity. So, what guidance can you give me, Martijn? I look forward to your question. Your answer.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words and your question. So the question is whether or not, let's say what the framework would be moving forward in working from home. And so I have two thoughts on this. One, I would say, of course, the paper, the chapter that I wrote suggests how to optimize, or which things matter at least, which things are related to productivity and the willingness to work from home, but also burnout. So the one thing is, of course, to say indeed ventilation is a very important matter. I'm very much a fan of my of my controls and interpreting my controls. About one of the things that we find is that people are more productive when they have a partner, but they shouldn't be at home during work. So I think that's one reason we should one finding we should take to heart, and for sure send our partners out during working times. But more generally, I think we're not quite done. So based on the chapter that I have, I of course suggest that there's a relationship, but the directionality is still to be examined. And another thing that I also generally conclude from the thesis is that the self-report is at times, let's say, there are reasons to question the self-report at times. So moving forward, I would highly suggest, and I think we're already moving towards it, to measuring more indoor environment. So I know a lot of people that have little sensors in their homes and try to care about it. It's of course still very difficult. But I think measuring is one. And second, I think, and that's also something that we have to see in the future, the pandemic itself has an effect on how we perceive productivity and working from home. When we don't have the options to work from home, working from home is the standard. But when we have the opportunity to work from home, but we don't have to, then we will be more, I imagine that we will be more critical on where we are really productive. So the measuring of the productivity instead of experience productivity, I think will also be a very important indicator in designing the policies moving forward. But overall, I think that we all cannot deny that the health effects of a healthy indoor environment is really related to productivity, also by amazing work by my colleagues. So I think that should be a major part of policy moving forward, improving healthy homes, healthy offices, also at home, not only at the office.
Okay,
I hope that answers the question.
That does. Thank you, Martijn.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Piran Jiao. He is an associate professor in the Department of Finance.
Dear candidate, dear Martijn, first congratulations on the excellent thesis and also very informative and entertaining defense. We really enjoyed it. My question is on chapter 3 and proposition number 2. I quote your proposition number 2. You wrote, recalled productivity scores from the past are often more related to your current productivity than to your past productivity. So you are interpreting your survey results as a recall bias, and then you are relating them to relating the recall bias to your survey elicited measures of productivity, stress, and all other variables that you measured. So my question is whether it is safe to interpret these results as a recall bias, given that you are using first, it's, as you also mentioned, self-report, and also Likert scale, which also has no objective quantitative benchmark of whether their recall was accurate or not, right? So, I mean, given that people answer Likert scale questions in relative terms anyways, I mean, if you asked at this moment, what's your productivity and what was your productivity last period on the Likert scale, they're probably highly likely to be influenced by their current answer. I mean, it's not necessarily a recall bias. It could be an anchoring effect on the Likert scale, or it could be that people form a belief about or form a perspective about their past based on their experience since then, right? Because they didn't have this new experience when they were reporting last time, but then, since then, they experienced new things, new productivity levels, and then they report differently.
Dear esteemed opponent, thank you for your words and your question. I think your question is extremely relevant, and I would agree with you to a large extent. So what we aim to do in this chapter, in the second part of the chapter, is to see what the limitations are of self-report. Besides the fact that I agree that the argumentation, whether or not this is truly a recall bias, or it's a carryover effect, or an anchoring effect, I will have to agree with your argumentations. It's an interpretation of the results. But I still think it's important to note it, in the extent that, especially in the domain of working from home, there's a lot of publications. Nick Bloom is doing a lot of work on this, and what we see is that a lot of these conclusions revolve around how productive are you now and how productive were you before the pandemic, especially in the beginning of this. And I think although I agree with you that the specific mechanics are, let's say, arguable, I think it's important to note that they are related, so that there seems to be either a carryover or recall bias in this sense. Evidently, I think also, and it shows a bit in the chapter, what we're doing is, I wouldn't call it experimental, but we're trying to explain the results in that sense, using some interpretations, which at some point I would say could also be improved. I have also, reading it a couple of times recently, I thought, maybe we should do this in a different manner. Nevertheless, I still support my manner, but it's my approach. But it's not rock solid. I think that's the conclusion. It's not a rock solid conclusion. But nevertheless, I think it's important to highlight that there seems to be something going on over time. And asking people at the same time how you feel now, how you felt then, and then making assumptions about the difference between them, that's something that we should do with caution.
Okay. If I may, I have a follow-up question that's related to this.
Go ahead.
In your equation 1 in chapter 3 on page 61, it's the equation or the regression from which you draw this conclusion about the relationship between recalled productivity measure and their actual productivity measures. So I'm wondering why you want to include this interaction between two continuous variables, T1 and T2, the report of your measured variable at this moment and in the past, that's the actual report in the past, and use this interaction term in the regression for recalled measures. And your interpretation is that, I quote on page 61, you wrote that this interaction term controls for the influence of one predictor on the other. Introducing this in the model will unveil the average effect of each predictor whilst keeping their relationship constant. I want to wonder, I'm thinking about what you mean by keeping the relationship constant and how can we interpret this interaction of two continuous variables? It's typically very difficult.
Yeah. Yes. This is, you're putting your finger, of course, on the weakest point in my whole thesis, which is 250 pages long. But this is exactly the point that I've, and I think you've noted this before, and I would approach this differently. I can tell you the reasoning, so I will explain to you the reasoning that what we attempted to do, and we looked at the variation. So the results, for instance, on page 67 in the regression results indicate that both T1 and T2 have a significant prediction on the R2 for RT1. And what we saw in the graph is that they are moving perpendicular, so they're moving moving parallel. And what I thought of is that it could be that because they're moving parallel, if the T1 goes up, so if the current state goes up, T2 goes up, it could be that the relationship between T1 and T2 means it also goes up, and then it moves similarly. So then it's trying to explain them both. And I try to capture that out of it. Now, whether or not this is the best approach, I would find that debatable. So I think you have a great point, and I think this is something I will look into in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Your position will be continued by Professor Caroline Gaukens, and she's a professor on marketing and consumer behavior.
Dear candidate, dear Martijn, congratulations on your work. I think we all agree that you studied topics that are very relevant and timely, so congratulations on that. Of course, I prepared some questions for you. My question deals with your chapter 2, in which you compare 5 different formats to convince people to stay at home or to not visit crowded places. My question is twofold, and the first question relates to the theoretical motivation behind your manipulations. So I was wondering, what exactly did you expect to find a priori, and on which theories did you rely? So for instance, why would you expect a difference between scenario A and B? Is this prevention versus promotion focus? Is stay home maybe less ambiguous than avoid crowded places? Or is it maybe that one is more negatively framed and the other one more positively framed? So what are your thoughts on this? My second question, related question, has to do with your DV. So the intention to visit a crowded place. So how exactly should we interpret this measure? So in scenario A, your DV represents non-compliant behavior. Huh? People are asked to stay at home and you don't do that. But in your scenario C, you say you should avoid visiting crowded places, and actually people do that because it's quiet on the streets. So I could say this might be compliant behavior. So what are we exactly looking at?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. I hope I will remember both answers,
Okay.
so maybe I'll come back to you. So the first is the a priori question, what we expect from staying at home and avoiding busy places. So the reason we decided to choose these two conditions because these were the two conditions that we actually experienced. A priori, we would hope or expect that this would be the baseline. So we use the non-context or the B context of avoiding busy places as the no context for the other ones. But I also wanted to see whether or not there was a difference between staying at home and avoiding busy places. So avoiding busy places would suggest that there is some leniency in whether or not you can make these decisions. And what we a priori would expect is that people stay, if we tell people to stay at home, they would stay at home. So this is almost like a manipulation check, if you will, to understand whether or not people understand this difference. So that's the first part. The second part is whether or not it's quiet on the streets and whether or not they're then compliant, yes or no. I think that's an interesting question because it's also the core of the chapter. So the core of the chapter is whether or not it's quiet on the streets is the same as it's quiet on the crowded place. Now, it's quiet on the streets is a very explicit description of what the situation is. Of course, what we hope to experience is that everybody that's at home knows how quiet it is on the street, right? So this is all the information that they have available at the time. Now, if that it's quiet on the street does not mean that they're compliant in avoiding the crowded places. So it's not the case that if it's quiet on the street, nobody's at a crowded place. It would be a strong assumption to say that everybody is spread out the world equally. The crowded place should be a crowded place for a reason. And I think this is also why we tested it. So the policy assumed that people knew what is categorized as a crowded area and what is not categorized as a crowded area. And I think that's why it's so interesting to see whether or not people they see outside and they make inferences on whether or not it's a crowded area wherever they are going, whether or not they assume that this is equal, yes or no, and how this then affects the escalation, so to speak, at the actual crowded area, albeit the beach or a park.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Paul Smeet. He's a professor in sustainable finance at the University of Amsterdam.
Dear candidate, dear Martijn, let me first of all also compliment you on a really nice thesis. I found it very interesting to read. And also on your own increase in productivity over time. My question, you seem to be the expert on self-reports. Almost all your chapters are about self-reports. You also critically reflect on self-reports, right, in some of your chapters. So my question to you is, within the studies of productivity, when would you say, is it valid to use self-reports? And when is it not valid? So what are the conditions under which you can do so? And also, for which statements would you feel comfortable generalizing your self-report results to the real world, and when not?
Can you repeat the last question?
Yeah, so when do you feel comfortable to generalize your findings on self-reports to real-life behavior, right?
Yeah.
And in which cases would you say, well, okay, maybe this is the case in these studies, but given what I've learned, I wouldn't draw policy on these self-report findings.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you. Thank you for your words. I would agree with the increased productivity over time, and I hope that it also will continue in the future. And thank you for your questions. I will start with the first. So I would argue that this is, to an extent, also a matter of taste, whether or not you would, under which conditions you would find productivity, self-reported productivity questionnaires valid. I would assume that if you would do this repeated over time without any severe changes in conditions, you would probably be accurate in estimating your own productivity compared to others, compared to yourself in the same condition. So
And how do we know that? That it's accurate?
Well, it's the second part of my answer would be that I would argue more and more in favor of measuring productivity, so objectively measuring productivity. How do we know it? It's less likely to be biased by external events that we would assume does not affect our productivity, but in real life does affect our probability of productivity. I'm looking forward to the current situation in which we are able to measure productivity more and more. Now, also this is arguable because the high-skilled productivity is not as easily measured as low-skilled productivity. But at least we should be able to find proxies that would give us a little bit of an objective handle to see whether or not our self-report is completely accurate or whether or not this goes up and down with the wind, so to speak.
Yeah, but what we have now, would you now recommend policymakers to draw conclusions based on self-reports?
Yeah, that's
not yet.
I would say not yet. And specifically, so we're coming to a point where where I assume it's higher correlated with actual productivity compared to the whole pandemic situation. So this also answers partially your second question. The big side note that we have to make with the majority of the chapters is that this is done in a pandemic period in which there could be unobservables that affect not only productivity but also self-report. How do we perceive ourselves? Are we happy? Are we sad? Are we scared? And this might affect our report in general. So, yeah. I lost the end of my sentence, but I think the beginning was pretty good.
So the answer is no. Policymakers should not take your dissertation and make advice based on your self-report findings.
Yeah. So, but it's not completely true. So I think what we do show is that in specific conditions where we are in novel conditions, this is also what I mentioned in the thesis. This is like a novel experience, a novel situation in which we are able to investigate it. But that does not mean that it's only relevant to pandemic situations.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, we will continue this discussion, I'm sure, during lunch. But thank you, Paul.
The opposition will be continued by Nicholas Duran. He is an assistant professor in real estate finance at the University College of London.
Thank you. Esteemed candidate, dear Martijn. Well, first, let me congratulate you on this impressive achievement. I think it's a fantastic thesis. I enjoyed reading it a lot, and it demonstrates how much effort you have put into becoming the fine scholar that you are, I think. But I have a little question for you. I'd like to focus on chapter 2 as well, like many have already. But from the way I read this chapter, it seems to suggest that the model that you're thinking about underlying this people derive no utility in being amongst each other. And, you know, from what COVID, one of the lessons is that we really do strive to be with other people and to have those social interactions. So what I'm thinking is, for example, a shopping street that you mentioned in the text, I don't think it's the same a shopping street with or without people, right? Mm-hmm. So this risk element is, or the crowded element is tainted by the utility that people would derive on being amongst other people. So would you care to elaborate on the ways that considering recreational places and crowds as complements rather than substitutes would change the interpretation of your results?
Dear esteemed opponent, thank you. Thank you for your words and your question. So the question is whether or not I would think that the results would change if I would include utility from, let's say, the social utility. It's a relevant question. It's a very interesting question. I think in the experiment, I kind of assume that there's a general distribution of how people are going to this busy place, whether or not they're going with the family or alone. And I mean, I would say it's a relatively safe assumption. So that kind of takes away the need to be surrounded with social people. In the extent you could take your whole family, go to a crowded place. What's important here is that I know that it's a recreational spot, so it's either, it could also be a beach and or a forest. I specifically didn't mention an event or I don't know, a dance hall or a concert. So I would argue that in my example specifically, this would be of less interest. Nevertheless, your question is, what would it be if that would be the case? And I think in that sense, the results would change in the sense that the risk that people are willing to take with their health would need to go up. So I would assume that the people that would go have a higher willingness to take risks with their personal health. And potentially, I could argue that in those situations, so now I'm envisioning a situation where I'm asking people specifically, do you want to go to an area where there's a lot of people close by where you can meet them, right? Because that would entail the social aspect. Then indeed I would imagine that the social risk would go up, and potentially, or at least according to the reasoning that I propose in this chapter, the higher education would go down, at least the strength would go down. So I argue that the highly educated or higher educated people are outsmarting other people in the sense that they're making a strategic decision. So they see it's empty outside, so I could go and it would still be empty. This would be the conclusion. In your example, this would not be the case, or this would not be the desired outcome. So then that would go down, I assume. So those are two examples of how I could see that my results would change. Additionally, I could also argue that there would be more it would be more linear. So when there are more people outside, I'm also more willing to go because I want to meet those people.
There might also be a threshold.
There might be a threshold, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
The opposition will be continued by Arie van der Lucht. He is an associate professor in psychology at the Faculty of Psychology at Maastricht University.
Thank you. Esteemed PhD candidate, dear Martijn, I have read your thesis with great pleasure, and I would like to share in the compliments for your eclectic mix of research. And you present it all under the wonderful umbrella of location-wise. I had to think back of Dr. Seuss all of the time, the places we go, and of course the places we didn't go. Because while reading your thesis, my mind often wandered back to the location decisions of the pandemic. A hammock in the living room, location wisdom of my youngest son, Luke, who just like you, in your PhD research, saw opportunities where others remained stuck in limitations and constraints. I was actually a bit of a location fool myself. I set up my base camp in the middle of our living room and expected the rest of my family to treat my virtual theater on the dining table with the same respect as the inner sanctum of a temple. That was a bit myopic of me. And there I was, on camera, talking to my students about my favorite fallacy, and you may still remember it, the quaternio terminorum, in an online version of the critical thinking course you did more than 11 years ago. And look where you are now, where that took you. Ik pas in mijn jas. Mijn jas past in mijn tas. Dus ik pas in mijn tas. Nee, ik zal het u niet aandoen om het voor te doen, maar het gaat niet. Martijn Stroom admires Gerd Gigerenzer. Gerd Gigerenzer admires Herbert Simon. Therefore, Martijn admires Simon. But what if Martijn admires Gigerenzer for his command of the German language? And Gigerenzer admires Herbert Simon for his theory of bounded rationality. Would you then expect this admiration to be transitive? My question concerns your study on the assessment of COVID infection risk in social networks in your chapter 6. And the question has 2 parts. First part of the question is a slightly more theoretical one. It is, of course, a question about transitivity. Transitivity is one of the epitomes of rationality. Take a relationship between 2 numbers, like greater than. 5 is greater than 3. You agree, right? Mm-hmm. 7 is greater than 5. You agree, right? So, 7 is greater than 3, right, Martijn? If you prefer bananas over apples, and if you prefer apples over oranges, then you should prefer bananas over oranges, right, Martijn? Because you're a rational dude, right? If you don't, you're displaying serious irrational behavior. But the logic of transitivity breaks down in the case of ambiguities, like my jacket, which is not the same when it's on my shoulders and when it's in my bag, or when you use vague terms like admiration. In economics, the assumption of transitive preference prevents the type of money pump that is so eloquently presented in Dr. Seuss's story of the sneetches on the beaches. In that story, the sneetches, the smart entrepreneur Sylvester McMonkey McBean, uses his star-on and star-off machines to add and remove the stars of the bellies of the fictional sneetches on the beaches. It costs $3 to remove a star and $10 to add one. And the sneetches cycle through preferring bellies with and without stars, because at the beginning, the ones with stars were better than the ones without, a bit similar to the robes that some people wear and others don't, right? And that guy, this Mr. McBean, he just manages to get them through cycles of preference until all of their money is spent. And then Sylvester packed up his machines and went. Intransitivity can easily arise from features of bounded rationality. Deciders who choose by a process of elimination can easily fall into the trap, but also framing can create cycles of preference. So, to what extent, Mr. Stroom, have you observed intransitivity in the preferences of your participants in the social network study? And what do you think was the main cause of that? Was it elimination or framing? Second part of the question is more specific about your choice of experimental paradigm. Do you think, and listen very carefully now, do you think the results could have been influenced by the fact that experts rated the best and the worst, which makes them swap between positive and negative frames? Would it not have been better to use a method like best, an alternative proposed by Gijben and colleagues to avoid this? I would love to hear your reply to these questions.
Yeah, esteemed opponent, thank you for your question and introduction. I must admit, I'm slightly lost. I'm trying to figure out the last question. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more. So the question would be whether or not it affects that I let people rank the networks in best to worst.
Yeah, so actually my question is about the fact that you used a particular paradigm that invites bounded rationality responses. And your conclusion is that this applies to how people look at networks. And I think it may just be an artifact of the paradigm you used. So it's actually quite similar to the question asked by my colleague earlier on, that maybe in some of these cases we really need to scrutinize the research methods. A similar question was asked by my colleague on the other side about the use of self-reports. So in all of these cases, it's actually very important to really think very hard whether the method you have employed to get these data that you analyze fantastically with state-of-the-art stuff, whether these measures have actually introduced something in the measure that will yield that result irrespective of how people would normally judge these networks.
Yeah.
That's the non-Dr. Seuss version of the question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So first, what I'm trying to imagine how we could have, let's say, better investigated this in an understandable way. And I think there's a discussion to be made whether or not how we construct the networks, but that's not your question. So it's not about the networks that we construct, it's about how we let them judge it. And I am... So an alternative measure would be we let people estimate the actual risk. So we just give them a network and say, how risky is this network to you? How do you... instead of letting people judge it compared to, so that it would be the comparative, I would give them an objective opportunity to objectively estimate this. We did this in a pilot study. So in a pilot study, we gave people pairs and let them, which had the exact same objective probability, and let them rank it whether or not which one was higher or lower. And then from this, of course, we could technically better assume which one was more risky, which characteristics were deemed more risky than the other ones. Now, what happened is when we asked people to assess the probability, it was all over the place. So people complained a lot during the open question that we also have to always add into this. And people were really writing essays about how we were even possible to ask these questions. Which to some part, of course, then supports your claim in saying, okay, if people cannot estimate it, then why am I letting them rank them? However, in practice, I would argue that this is a decision that we're still making. We're still assessing which risks we deem as more risky, yes or no. And here, are we limiting the response in the method that we're using here? But at this time, I would find it difficult to find an easy alternative that is generalizable and still takes use of at least allows people to easily respond.
Well, you could at least get rid of the framing effect by just using the best paradigm, right? And then you still are left with elimination as a possible. So,
yeah.
But I fully agree with you that it's very hard to assess, and I think it's incredibly interesting. And I was really triggered by the experiment. That's why I thought very hard about the question.
Yeah.
But you also, you remark like, so the first thing people appear to look at is how many red dots there are. To me, that also begs the question, okay, red is a natural warning signal. Could it just be a simple, very simple visual thing that they're using to just deal with your crazily difficult experiment?
Yeah.
Because people in experiments are always guesstimating and satisficing, right?
Yeah. Great remark. I think indeed, maybe we've been a little bit, let's say, we've used the opportunity and we also used the context of infection, bad is red, so that people understood it easily. The next step in this chapter, or the next step from this paper onwards, is that we want to see whether or not, and that slightly alleviates your point, is that we want to see whether or not people do this also in positive networks. So whether or not, if we keep the networks completely similar, we would say, okay, now there's innovation, there are the titans of industry, and you want to harvest the network. I think in the conclusion I also talk about spread, risk, and harvesting. So whether or not it's innovation, business, and then we would have the same networks, but then have either a positive framing, or we would change the colors, but have the same negative framing, to see whether or not indeed this nudges, or how you would call it, would affect these results. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The proposition continues by Professor Bart Goldstein, and he is a professor in economics, especially human capital and social economics.
Dear candidate, dear Martijn, congratulations on finishing your thesis. It's a wonderful piece of work. I very much enjoyed reading it. I think your analyses are relevant, novel, creative and insightful, and it's very well written. And especially enjoyed the acknowledgements, which in my view reveal kind of an Oscar-type sense of humor. Very, very nice. My question relates to your analysis in chapter 4. I'll keep it briefer.
You don't have to, per se. You can.
On page 111 and 112, you investigate the effect of ventilation on productivity. And by means of a mediation analysis, you show that the amount of time a home office is ventilated not only directly increases satisfaction, but indirectly increases productivity as well. And I was triggered very much by the interpretation of the analysis. You write on these pages, I quote, "Practically, this means that changing from not ventilating at all to ventilation all the time, so moving from 0 to 100%, will indirectly increase productivity with 0.5 points on the 10-point productivity scale. And this magnitude of this estimate on productivity is, and here was the part that really triggered me, is comparable to moving from no children to having children at home during working hours."
You may continue answering the question.
Continue answering the question.
You may start.
Let me phrase the question, if I may. So I actually had young children at home during this pandemic, and I was very, I find it hard to believe that the results of ventilation are equally big as having young children running around, maybe homeschooling them. So my question is, how do you explain this?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. I will keep it brief, because I have to, of course, otherwise I would rather elaborate on this. So I would have to read into this, right? So there's nothing that I do in this chapter that gives an answer to this or that I'm testing this. So of course, the easy answer is that we look at the intensity of the effect, and then I compare it to what we see already on the regressions on productivity. Now, you would argue that having children is worse, or at least. Yes. Now, personally, I cannot conclude this, but I think, and to speak in favor of my results, I think it's also underestimated how much ventilation will do for you. So I would then, in very short, I would suggest, opening the door to ventilating, but that also moving the kids out at the same time. That could maybe then relieve both problems.
In my view, you could. Part of the answer lies in that it's not causal in nature.
Yeah, no,
right?
Also true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Martijn Stroom, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed, and the degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and are returned in this room.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Hit the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
benieuwd. Ja. Wat moet ik doen?
Martijn Stroom, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its
Please
positive
put on the
verdict,
microphone and put it back.
in view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Eichholz is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisors to now take the floor.
Martijn, there's one thing you should now do, and that is to give us an oath. Okay. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I do.
I thought so. Okay, therefore, by the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Martijn Stroom, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of our university.
Still learning, eh? Still learning. Okay. Got about 7 pages of material here, Martijn.
Yeah, get some more water.
All right. Dear Martijn, dear Dr. Stroom, as we can now and will now say from here onwards, it's an honor to hold a laudatio, a lofrede for you, because applause and plaud you deserve. First of all, you deserve that for grit. And this story has been told many times, but it needs to be retold, as many stories will be retold during the remainder of the day. Who knew that when you walked in 6 years ago for an interview for a PhD in behavioral finance with Paul Smeets, you actually ended up with a PhD in finance and real estate. Martijn applied for a position in behavioral finance, but somehow ended up interviewing for our position in real estate finance. That kind of came about during the interview, and Martijn after the interview said, well, it's very interesting, and Professor Eichholz, really interesting, but no thank you. Well, Professor Eichholz and myself, we don't really take no for an answer, so Martijn started his PhD in real estate. Well, after about 6 months, and I really think it was after Paulo's PhD course in econometrics, time series econometrics probably, Martijn said, well, yeah, I'm a psychologist, I just can't handle this finance stuff, so sorry, I'm out. So, well, Martijn, that's not going to happen. So, okay, I'll continue. Well, another half year later, you had some personal issues, you broke up with what you thought was your eternal love, you started to rethink your life, including your PhD project. You said, well, I really think that I should do something else in life. We said, well, Martijn, no. Okay, well, I'll continue. So you continued, and I don't think you've looked back ever since. Well, maybe a bit, that ex-girlfriend, but certainly not on your PhD project in real estate. And even if you had moments of doubt during the latter 4 years, you never really showed, because by heart, you're an optimist, you're a positivist. I'm not sure that's a word, but if it's not a word, you know, it's a word as of today, and you're a great motivator. We never really had any doubt that you would finish, and that's why we kind of pulled you back into the project from time and time again, because you're really an academic, a scientist, because of your inherent curiosity. And this guy, you know, would basically fit anywhere. And it was nice to hear from Ari on your kind of the early stage of your career in psychology, and you could have done a PhD there. But equally, I think you could have done a PhD in econometrics. You'd probably say, you would respond. But if you think about the breadth of what you've done, and somebody called it today an eclectic collection of works, you've put heaters into a room to simulate a hot environment. You've basically done a survey during the pandemic to assess whether people would go out or not. And then you even worked, and I think I saw Martin there, with hardcore economists on risks in networks. I mean, who knew that you could do that? No, well, yeah, you're hardcore anyway. So, and that grit, I think, really pulled you through all of those projects, even though, you know, you didn't really work with hardcore economists. You have worked so hard, and I really appreciate that, because, yeah, I like people that work hard. I did not know, and I read it in the acknowledgements, that you were even sending emails on kitchen floors at parties at 3 a.m. I think that should stop, but you've been working really hard. And also, what's really important in terms of grit, you're not afraid to chase. You're not afraid to chase certain co-authors, even though they're not economists. You really make sure that you get the answer and that you move forward and that papers are submitted. So you even managed to manage the statistics. I think you overdid it a little bit to the work from home paper, where Martijn proudly said that he had, whatever, 25,000 lines of code to finally manage this. I think that was more a sign of inefficiency, but you managed to manage the statistics. And in all of that research, Martijn, you do that with bravado. Now, I thought I came up, was like, yeah, Martijn, bravado. And then yesterday, Leanne was reading the acknowledgements. Leanne's my wife. I also read it. I do read the books that people give to me. And she said, hey, Martijn says that you're bravado. I'm like, no, you got to be kidding me. So you assign bravado to me, I assign bravado to you. There might be causality, but I think bravado, and I looked it up, it says an almost over-the-top amount of courage. But with you, Martijn, it's never really over the top. It's passion, and it really suits you well, that bravado. Your recent endeavor, and you've of course all seen it because you talk about Linde Kattenberg, but you've seen Martijn in the news. You heard him on Radio Zeeland, you saw him on L1, you read the op-eds, and it was all on climate risk. You're like, well, climate risk? Is this guy doing work on climate risk? Well, you didn't know it. You also didn't know a whole lot about climate risk. But this guy is now a national expert on climate risk in the housing market. He's providing policy advice. He's talking to companies that develop products, not hindered by any prior knowledge or research on the topic of climate risk. That is what I call bravado. And you do that because you have an aptitude, difficult word, but a nose for what's hot. Yeah, you kind of think about, yeah, hot, the waitress at coffee, the girl at Daily Bells. Not that kind of hot. I'm sure you have an aptitude for that as well, as experienced over the years, but hot from an academic topic perspective. Now, not all ideas made it over the finish line, so you didn't see them all here today, but Martijn at some point had a great idea during the pandemic to look at red light camera and speeding tickets from the CJIB. You know, we all kind of feared that envelope on the doormat. And to actually look how people responded to the curfew, because at some point we all needed to be home at 8 or 9. I do think personally that idea stemmed from your own personal experience with the CJIB and other forms of law enforcement. And sadly, it didn't make it over the finish line, but you did do other super interesting COVID-related research, for example. Do people go out even when you tell them to stay home? And I do think that this COVID research was also coming about by your own first-hand experience with COVID, because this guy, for those who didn't know it, imported COVID into Limburg. ladies and gentlemen. He went skiing in Austria, brought it home, probably celebrated Carnival. This was the guy who basically, that led to the spread of COVID in Limburg. And then, so he was an early adopter, but then also managed to get it as recent as 2 weeks ago. You almost destroyed your own PhD defense here, but luckily not. Well, on COVID, you're also the one who called me on a random Tuesday evening. I was buying diapers at the Albert Heijn. I vividly remember this, like, Niels, I have a shot for you. I'm like, well, Martijn, it's like 8, it's not really. No, Niels, you gotta be in 5 minutes, here and here, you're gonna get a corona shot. And this was still in the time when everyone was like, oh, I need a corona shot. So Martijn is a mover and a shaker, and that's really what this shows. And for those of you who think that, especially friends, not so much colleagues, that being an academic, Martijn is now sitting behind his desk all day, it's like, probably checking his email. No, this guy is a mover and a shaker in academia. And I think a sign of that is very tangible, is that he recently organized a conference, and he did that at the level of quality that somebody who did hotel school, who got a PhD from the hotel school, if that's possible, would be jealous of. So as I thought about this talk, I saw this badge. With the conferences, you always get badges, and you typically just throw them away. But this is a badge made by Martijn. You can't see it from there, but it gives me exactly what time I need to go to stage for sound check, what time the session starts, what I need to say. It gives me QR codes for Wi-Fi, speakers, and program, and it even has spelled my name right. Well, that's the level of detail that Martijn put into the conference. So that mover-shaker part is going to bring you very far. Now, those are all great characteristics that professionally, I think will push you forward and further create your growth. But you're also a very nice guy. And I think that also needs to be said. You're genuinely interested in others, whether that's the PhDs in the department or outside of the department, whether it's the secretaries, not just in finance, but also in marketing. And I'm pretty sure you know them all in the whole building and other buildings. But also your master students and all of the honor students that you supervised. A joke, a smile, a conversation. You're really a great colleague, you're a friend, and you're a very loyal one at that. That needs to be said. Now, Martijn, and ladies and gentlemen, this career could have gone a very different way. I was standing here 4 weeks ago, and Pete was talking about my career in catering. Well, Martijn actually was a very successful sports instructor at the Maastricht Athletic Club. This guy, and there's pictures of Martijn, he was doing like the body pump, and I could see you working there, taking over the place from Constance. And even during the PhD, you managed to spend about 2 hours per day at the Mac, as it's called. 2 hours per day. And yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot, especially since you gave me this beautiful hard copy, because this is the level of detail, again, that Martijn puts in. The supervisors and probably the parents, they get a hard copy. It's very special. And on the front is a Greek god. And Martijn claims it's AI generated. Well, I did some research, and it's not AI generated. He's called Adonis. And Adonis, Adonis is, of course, a Greek god, and there's some Greek mythology that you need to know for those of you who don't know it. He was the best-looking guy of his time. He was carved out of stones. He had, biceps like melons and quads like what's even bigger melons. And he had abs, Martijn. Oh man, it was just out of this world. Adonis was adored by gods, men and women alike. Also the men, they liked him. And the idea was that Adonis would spend about a third of his year with Aphrodite, a third of the year with Persephone, and a third of the year with somebody of his choice. It's a great life, right? So I was thinking like a third with Pete, a third with me, a third with Martin or something like that. But, well, what Adonis did, he then decided to spend all of his time with Aphrodite. So I think that's kind of a wise choice. And then he basically ended his life, and I think the parallel kind of stops there, because one of the gods, he was so angry and kind of unclear who it was, he basically dressed as a boar and then killed Adonis. And I was thinking, well, that's unlikely. You're this unlikely guy to go hiking in Meersen and meet like a wild swine there, so I don't think this is how it's going to end. But in more modern terms, Adonis is often referred to in the context of the Adonis complex. The Adonis complex, I cite, is about men that want to be more beautiful, more lean, and more fit. Well, personally, I don't really see the parallel with you, but I am somewhat worried about your ability to continue to go to the gym for 2 hours per day in the next step of your career. The next step of Martijn's career, for those of you who don't know it, he's going to be a postdoc, and part of that means that he's going to spend a lot of time in the United States of America. This guy is going to be a jet setter, flying to the United States, flying around in the United States, but it may mean that you have less gym at your disposal over the next couple of months, maybe years. Now, as you kind of start to settle in, perhaps potentially also with your own Aphrodite, the need for 14 hours of gym per week also, I can tell you from experience, then kind of goes away a little bit. But still, I do believe in the notion of a healthy mind and a healthy body. So that brings me to the first present. We have a series of presents. You probably already saw it lying here, and it's like, oh no, I get it also. Yes, you get it, the 4-Hour Body, an uncommon guide to rapid fat loss, incredible sex, and becoming superhuman. So I really only give this to you for the becoming superhuman, and I did some back of the envelope calculations, and you spend 7 times 2 hours in the gym these days. It's about 14 hours. Well, this guy, Timothy Ferriss, says you can do it in 4. That's saving you 10 hours per week. That's another day to work on your fantastic research, and productivity will basically go through the roof. That's what I call efficiency. Now, of course, as you kind of cramp yourself into these small jets into the US with hand luggage, the jet-setting life, this might be a little bit big to carry around. And you may also want to bring some other books. At least that's what I thought until I read your acknowledgement, which basically say, any book I get from my supervisors, I acknowledge and I then put away. So, well, we had a present that I thought was a great fit, but then you got to promise me that you start reading the books that we give to you, which is a Kindle Paperwhite, which is, a small little e-reader, and on it is the 4-Hour Body. And the other books we gave you, and we're going to ask questions about those books, just to make sure that you really read them. So, dear Martijn, dear Dr. Stroom, congratulations with your achievement over the past years and with your fantastic achievement today, because it was a great show. I also have to congratulate you on behalf of Lian and the 3 J's, because not only does this guy win over the hearts and minds of colleagues, etc., but also of my 3 little kids, Jonah, Jules, and Joshua. And so they also congratulate you, and they do want to play soccer with you very soon. Pete and I, we look forward to many more years of working with you, and to many more years of Martijn's bravado. So congratulations.
Dear Dr. Stroom, what else could be said after this long laudatio? Also, on behalf of the Maastricht University, I would like to congratulate it on achieving your degree. Before I close the session, I want to tell the audience that the Corona first goes taking a photograph with us. That takes a little bit of time. You could already join the reception at the Rafter. But I also want to invite the parents to join us for being on that photograph. It's your one moment in your lifetime that you see all those fancy guys with dressed up in a gown. So I'd like to close the session. Thank you all for being here, and enjoy the day.